Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, right here on Paul's page. Um, so I've learned a few things over the weekend, and one of them is when I watched the video from last Friday and saw how active my hands were, I realized I need to try and keep my hands down so as not to, blur everything. And then a friend of mine says, well, there's a possibility you could have found a better example for the explanation of honest, open, and willing than a history lesson about Christendom. And I said, you're probably right. Although I'm completely invested now, so I guess I'll just have to carry on. So at the end of last Friday, we were talking about how open, honest, and willing. And I was using the example of a history lesson of the development of Christendom or Christianity here in the West, from Moses forward. And last Friday we got to Martin Luther and was talking about I was talking about the creation, if you will, of the Protestant movement. One of the things I didn't touch on was that before and during Martin Luther's period, there was such a thing as the Inquisition that was going on in the Catholic Church. And the Inquisition basically boiled down to wiping out all of the remaining earth religion consciousness, wiping out the remaining pagan consciousness. And the way that worked was that cancel that. So the way that worked is that Rome put out a doctrine of what Christendom believes. And it was like the law, because at that time, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope were highly aligned. And so, if you were a person who was really involved in herbology and healing, other than the healing that was prescribed by the church, or if you had a perspective about how God may or may not exist separate from what Rome was putting out, then you were considered a heretic and you would have been judged by a particular group of people designated by Rome. And if you were found guilty, you would be killed. They implied some incredible techniques of torture and all kinds of other things to basically get people to admit that they were, in fact, witches or heretics, and then they would kill them. So, this was another aspect of how the development of Protestantism came into being. So, once Martin Luther survived and came through, and Protestantism began to develop, then there were sects of Protestantism that didn't agree with other sects of Protestantism. And there were, the whole concept that came down from Rome that here is a particular group of rules or dogma that one must follow. And if one doesn't follow, then they are, in fact, heretical. Well, that concept sort of carried over into all the different sects of Christianity that developed. If you didn't agree with the teachings of the Lutherans, then the Lutherans would shun you. If you didn't believe with the teachings of the Methodists, then the Methodists would shun you. And so there were all of these groups of people who were basically refugees who were hanging out here and there, like in enclaves all over Europe, um, at or around the middle 1500s, 1500, um, cancel that, 1440 to, well, the War of the Sects continues on today, but somewhere in middle or early 1400, these enclaves of people began to develop. And one of those enclaves were the Dutch, and the Dutch were their particular belief process that took them away from the standard Catholic process, as well as the Protestant groups that were available, was called Quakerism. And the Quakerism was really a practice that the practitioners withdrew from the regular society and maintained their own enclaves and practiced some rather strict um, doctrinal beliefs that held them out and separate from the day-to-day society that the existing Christian religions, which were very much, entwined with business and with society, and the Quakers withdrew from that. And so those people were all gathered and actually became the mainstay of the first group of individuals who came from Europe to the Americas, to the what would become later on the United States of America. Now, here's a funny little aside to that. So, Christopher Columbus is known for having captained that first group to the Americas. Now, Christopher Columbus was an Italian who was serving the Spanish Queen, who was in the employ of England. Cancel that. That's not true. Who had gone into the northern part of Europe and contracted themselves out to carry this group of people over to the Americas, to get them out because they were not desirable where they were in Europe. And so they arrived here. And so Quakerism became the first real Christian sect that arrived in the Americas. And again, this goes back to how honest, open, and willing, in that once we know the honest reality of what happened, and we are open to allow that to be so in our lives, and we are willing to hear it and see how it's impacted us, it allows us to see who we are today, and as a result of that, make choices as to whether we desire to continue being that way. So the Quakers arrived, and the development of America as we know it, the United States of America, ensued, and more Europeans arrived, and more Europeans arrived. And as more and more Europeans arrived, the more and more influence of the different sects of Protestantism played out through the colonies. And so, in fact, as the colonies developed, there were colonies of Protestants who were Lutheran, who were Quaker, who were Presbyterian, Methodist, Calvinists, and on and on and on. What was not here and what was not embraced in the early days was the Roman influenced Catholicism or Greco-Orthodox, or in reality, very much of the Jewish population that was also in Europe at the time. And so they came here and they lived their lives and they expanded their consciousness and they played out and they became involved and they got into what's going on and the development of this place known as America, the colonies. And then there was a revolt, and the revolt against England was empowered by the whole concept that each of these groups wanted the freedom to experience their religious belief as it is, without the pressure of government telling them what to do. And so that was one of the fundamental aspects of the development of the United States of America. Besides the overwhelming taxation and control that the empire of the United Kingdom, wasn't United Kingdom then, the empire of England was trying to lay upon them. And so that happened, and the development continued to happen, and the Revolutionary War happened, and the separation between America, the United States of America, and England took place. And then there was more. England used America the same way they used the American colonies, the same way they used Australia, and dumped a lot of people here in a penal colony sort of concept where people would show up as indentured servants, whether they be English or Irish or Scottish or Dutch or French or German. If they were in the streets in England and they weren't considered desirable gypsies, they would be arrested for any trumped up charge, put on a ship, shipped to the Americas, shipped to Australia, be indentured servants who then developed those colonial areas. So slavery did not begin in the Americas with African slaves. Slavery began in America with Caucasian Euro-Anglo slaves and expanded as we moved forward. The development of the spiritual consciousness expanded and expanded and expanded. And so there were sects of the original Protestant faiths that arrived on the shores as Irishmen and Italians were moved in under indentured slavery. They brought with them Catholicism, generally speaking, Roman Catholicism. They brought it with them. They were persecuted here in the colonies as a result of that. And so it was underground, and it developed over time until we finally get to the place where it's in around 1800, 1830. And by this time, the whole United States had developed. The War of 1812 was over. The spiritual split between all these different sects existed. And in truth, there were then states that were more focused on one particular religious persuasion than another particular religious persuasion. It moved from the colonial impact out to state impact, and as a result of that became more expanded. And as a result of the push against that, because people, although we're in America, cancel that, although we were in the United States of America, where we had a constitution that said that we had religious freedom, The fact is you had the freedom to believe what was going on in that particular state or that particular area or that particular city, or you had the freedom to move somewhere else where maybe you would be more accepted, because there was, in fact, resistance by the primary group of embracing others in other Christian sects. That's just the way it was. And so finally, it boils down to, I mean, if you look at it, the Mormons came into existence as a result of some of this, and that whole story goes on and on. But it gets to the point that the fundamental teachings of the Christian message that the Bible lays out and that the Christ talked about, which was, we are made in the image and likeness of God, that the kingdom of heaven lies within, and that there are only two commandments: love God and love your fellow man as yourself. That's what the Christ brought to the existing Hebrew consciousness 2,000 plus years ago. But that message got lost in the translation, and it got all intertwined with work ethics and marriage ethics and color ethics and all kinds of other ethics, until we finally get to the point where the message is completely lost, and everyone has to basically choose for themselves. Pretty soon the Catholics are coming in, they're importing Irishmen and Italians to do the work of labor that the original colonial people were not in a position or did not choose to do. The railroads came into existence. Who was going to run the railroads? Who was going to lay the track? Well, in many cases in the East, it was Irish and Italian. In the West, it was Chinese. The Chinese brought in a whole different religious attitude and concept. And so we found ourselves in a complete melting pot, not only of individuals and different countries of influence, but also in different religious realities of influence. All the way from and the Greeks started coming. So when the Greeks started coming, they brought with them the Greek Orthodox concept or the Eastern Catholic concept, and here it all is, and it's all together. And about that time, a man by the name of Phineas Quimby, who was a Quaker from Vermont in and about 1840, came up with the idea that if one realized themselves, that essence of who I am, that place inside that is my soul, as the essence of God, and that God resides in heaven and the kingdom of heaven lies within, and that the whole point of being here as God's servant on the planet Earth was to realize and reconnect or remember that I am born in the image and likeness of God, and that the kingdom of heaven lies within, and that all there is to do is for me to realize that God is in fact love. Therefore, I am in fact love, and therefore I am positioned to embrace my fellow man as myself and realize that collectively, all together, we are God on earth. So Phineas Quimby brought this forward. He put out his shingle, his metaphysical shingle, up in Vermont in the early mid 1850s and carried this message forward. And this message then morphed into what we know today as New Thought, Science of Mind, with writers like Emily Cady and Emmett Fox. And that influence has carried out and is in fact now considered by some to be the basic practice that allows one to understand the presence of God as oneself. Yet, none of this is possible unless I apply an honest, open, and willing attitude to perceive how this developed and how this could be possible. Given the possibility that it's so, given the possibility that everything that I was taught as a child, that heaven is somewhere in the clouds, that God reigns over man like a king reigns over his kingdom, is non-functional. And that the real activity is to realize that God created everything, everything, and is in everything, and is therefore in me. When I can honestly, openly, and willingly look at the possibilities that are out there, set aside the fear, I realize that there's a lot more freedom available than I ever knew in my upbringing. And so I appreciate you all listening to me. I appreciate you all giving me the opportunity to share myself in this way. I am thankful for the opportunity and the inspiration to simply give it to you as it shows up to me. I am grateful that by embracing a new thought concept for myself and to embrace the idea that God is not separate from me, that God is me, and that I am God, and that God is everything, and that I am everything. When I come from this attitude with ego, with my material experience, I become confused. But when I set aside my ego and my emotions, I can see this as the only real idea. We know, we look out, we see birds. It says in Genesis that God created all these things and he endowed upon them all of these different aspects of God's self. I am the presence of God wherever I am. You are the presence of God wherever you are. We are the presence of God wherever we are. And we can have this world look the way we want it to look. But we must realize that our thoughts and our words have power. And if I believe that I am separate from that which created me, then I believe that I am separate from my fellow man and woman. And that separation attitude generates conflict. Conflict generates unrest. Unrest generates fear. Fear is the opposite of love. And therefore, I cannot live as the presence of God wherever I am. And I am cut off from the light. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. I embrace you as the presence of God. Namaste, namaste, namaste. Thank you. I don't know.